28. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Matthew 11:28. Today is going to be our third installment as we look across the Bible, specifically in the Old Testament right now, at women in the Old Testament. Today we're going to look at Esther. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and locate Esther chapter 4. And we're going to stay in really just in one verse today, or one passage, and that's chapter 14, or verses 14 through 16. So Esther 4, 14 through 16 is where we'll spend the majority of our time this morning. I must admit that as I was studying Esther and reading Esther, I remembered again, or was reminded again, of what a beautiful story Esther is. In fact, Esther has one of a picturesque, in some sense, literary structure. And the guys over, or the guys and ladies over at thebibleproject.com, if you've never heard or visited or watched any of their videos, I know some of you have, I would encourage you to go watch some of their storyboards of the Bible. It's animated, but not like animated in like a cartoons type format. Although they have some that are a little more like that. Specifically, the ones on the books of the Bible. It's called the Read the Bible or Read Scripture series. And they take every book in the Bible and they create this animated storyboard. You can find it on thebibleproject.com, or you can YouTube. In YouTube, you can search The Bible Project, and you can find all those. Today, you'll see a graphic up here in just a second. This is a very, very, very simplified version of their storyboard for the Book of Esther. And the Book of Esther is a beautiful story that highlights a biblical literary technique, which you can see up here, which is called a chiasm, or another author that I'm reading recently, Leonard Bailey, he calls it a prophetic rhetorical template. Any way you want to look at it. I learned it as a chiasm. Basically what happens is, on the right-hand side, the story goes down. And it goes down, 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 down. And then you have a point of resolution, which is in the middle, the green box. And then the story goes up, 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 up to the end. And if you'll notice, each tier is similar to the other side. So you start with feast, you end with feast. Someone's exalted, and someone else is exalted. And then there's a plan to kill the Jews and a plan to save the Jews. And all of it hinges on that green box in the middle, okay? So we're going to leave that up. And as we talk about the story, you'll see how this works, okay? So the book of Esther is set in Persia, in the Persian Empire, in the city of Susa, which is in modern-day Iran. The Persian Empire at this point was the largest empire in the world at the time. Greece had not quite risen or ascended to prominence. It was a little bit before that, and so Persia was the kingdom. It stretched basically from Iran, Afghanistan, all the way to Turkey, even into some of the Greek islands in the the Aegean Sea, and then all the way down into south of Egypt, into Ethiopia and northern Sudan. So just think about the span of how many millions of square miles that is. It's huge. And the winter home for the king was in Susa, and so our story is set in Susa. Now the story covers a long period of time. And historically, it occurs about 100 years after the Israelites are sent into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar. So if you were to read Kings, you were to read Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, and at the end of Kings and Chronicles, the Israelites are taken away into exile. Think from 100 years from that point, that's when our story occurs. Now, historically speaking, some of the Jews had already started to migrate back. Next week, we're going to talk about Nehemiah. Nehemiah and Ezra, they had already come back. Not all the Jews came back, as we'll see in our story. So historically, we're in the Persian Empire about 480s to 470s BC, 100 years after Israel was exiled by Nebuchadnezzar. The Persians take over. King, in Esther, his name is King. It's really hard to say. Someone uses his other name. His name is King Ahasuerus. Right? All right, so let's say that together. Ahasuerus. Right? That's the Hebrew version of his name. The Greek version is a lot easier. Xerxes. So I'll refer to him as Xerxes because that's a lot easier to say. Although not as funny. A lot easier to say. So here's the story. King Xerxes is trying to show his preeminence and his power. And so listen to this. He has a 6-month feast. 6 months. All the nobles from across his empire are there. And for 6 months, they party. Drinking, food, the best wine, the best of everything. 6 months. And then after the 6 months, he has a week-long party for all the residents of Susa. So it's like, hey, look, y'all been putting on the show for 6 months. We're going to throw y'all a party. Y'all can come into the king's court. And the text says, and it's kind of phrased weird, but what it means is, he's like, hey, look, you can eat whatever you want. You can drink whatever you want. As much as you want. It's all on me. And at the end of this 6-month and 1 week feast, you can imagine how everybody is acting or in. And so the king is in that same state, a little inebriated, a little probably gluttonous at some point, right? And so he says, hey, I want the queen to come out here, and I want everybody to see how beautiful she is. And so the queen, being sensible, is like, no, you're not going to do this to me. You can imagine there's probably a finger shake or a head bob or whatever you want to call it. And the king gets mad, furious, and he basically says, you're no longer the queen. And he's like, I'm done with you. And she never shows up in any Persian history again, and she never shows up in our story again. So we don't really know what happens to her. Her name is Vashti. She's kind of a character in it, but not really important. So the king has a dilemma, right? He needs a queen. This is where Esther comes in, and Mordecai, the other 2 of the 4 main characters. There's another one we'll talk about in just a minute. Right? So it started off with a feast. Well, then he needs a queen. So at the time that he's looking for a new queen, that's when Esther comes in, and through an amazing circumstance of events, he chooses Esther. Out of all the probably thousands of women, he chooses Esther. At the same time, our 4th character comes into play, and his name is Haman. Now, Haman is the villain in the story, okay? You need to keep that in mind. He's the villain in the story. And so Haman comes in, and Haman is a Canaanite, right? The Bible says he's actually from the tribe of Agag, so he is an Agagite. So that's really easy to say, right? But he's from Canaan, so he was enslaved as well. But he has risen to prominence in Xerxes' court. And so Xerxes puts him second in command. So there's Xerxes and then Haman. So pretty much Haman is like royalty, even though he's not. And so Xerxes exalts Haman, and pretty much Haman can do whatever he wants to do. Right? Pretty important position, right? All right, so Haman is exalted. Well, there's a problem, though, see? There are Jews, Esther's a Jew, and there's this other Jew named Mordecai, and there's some more. There's a lot of others. And Mordecai, he serves the Lord, and he doesn't bow down to anybody but the Lord. And so when Haman comes in the city gate, Haman is second in command. So he's like royalty, and he expects everybody to worship him as they do Xerxes, because he's second in command. Well, guess what Mordecai does? Not today, right? Not happening. Not today. And so Haman walks by, and Mordecai just sitting over there, propped up against the gate. And Haman's like, you're not going. Everybody else is on the knee. You're not going to take a knee? And Mordecai's like, nope. And Haman gets furious. And so what he does is he concocts this plan to kill all the Jews. Every one of them. And he comes up with this decree that's kind of underhanded. And he gets the king to sign it. And the king really doesn't understand the full implications of what he's doing. And he signs the decree. And so Haman is like, no, it is on. Mordecai, you're going. In fact, what he does is he erects this wooden spike in the middle of town. And he's literally going to throw Mordecai on it and impale him, literally. So he's so mad at Mordecai. Well, so we've gone down. So you're at this moment of okay, what's going to happen? Are the Jews all going to die? Because that's what the story does. Well, in the middle of this, in the green box, something changes. And it occurs around, you'll have to read it out. We don't have time to tell you all the details. It occurs in around chapter 6. there's two feasts. Esther throws two feasts for the king. By the way, at this time, the king still doesn't know she's a Jew. Keep that in mind. That'll be important later. But she throws two parties, two feasts, for the king, Xerxes, and Haman, the person who's trying to kill all the Jews, she's being one, right? So there's two feasts, and then a night of restless sleep. You ever had a night of restless sleep? Right? Mr. Dusty's back there waving both hands, right? A night of restless sleep. You know what I do during a night of restless sleep? I do one of two things. I either watch YouTube videos, or if I'm doing really good, I'll read. And if I read, I usually get sleepy quicker than watching YouTube videos. Man, YouTube's addictive. Like you just like scroll to the next one, scroll to the next one, scroll to the next one, right? Whereas reading, you're like, I can't get my eyes open. Well, the king can't sleep. And so he needs some bedtime reading. So he gets one of the people in the court to come in and he reads the history of his nation. And he comes to this important part where he realized he had forgotten Mordecai saved his life. And he says, hey, nothing's been done about that. He hasn't been rewarded. So at the feast, or during these two feasts, one's one day and one's the next day, the King Xerxes says, hey, Haman, how would you reward someone who the king delights in? And he goes all elaborate. And so the king says, hey, man, you remember that guy Mordecai? I want you to help him be honored. And Haman's like, what? And so through these feasts, night of restless, one feast, night of restless sleep, another feast, Haman ends up being killed. And Mordecai and Esther and the king save the Jews. Right? And so you have this entire role reversal. This plot, so we've gone down, 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 and now things are starting to change. But you still have this problem. The king still said that all the Jews were going to die on a specific day. So they're like, oh no, what do we do? So they come up with this plan. The three of them, the king, Mordecai, and Esther, come up with this plan of how they're going to save the Jews. And it works flawlessly. In fact, the Jews, to defend themselves against all attackers, the Bible says they killed over 100,000 people who on whatever day was prescribed for them to die, the attackers came and they defended themselves and won a mighty victory over their assailants. Right? And the book ends just as it began, with feasts. In fact, a new feast in Israel was created around this event. It's called Purim. And it is 2 days of celebration of how the Jews overcame, how God saved the Jews from the hand of Haman. One of my Old Testament professors at college, down at Britton Parker College, he said that by the time of Jesus, this some other things had come in this feast, and actually the kids, when they would on the day when they were celebrating the feast, they would read the story of Esther, and the kids would write Haman's name on the bottom of their shoe. They would write his name, and whenever Haman's name was read in the recitation, everybody would go boo, and the kids would like rub his name out from the bottom of their shoe. Hilarious, right? But that was because they were celebrating God's amazing work through Mordecai and Esther in saving the Jews from the hand of Haman. It is a beautiful story. If you have not read Esther, I would encourage you to go back and read it this week, as if it is truly a beautiful story. But more than a beautiful story, I believe there are two hugely significant points that we need to gain from the book of Esther, right? And both of them deal with God. The first deals with God's work in the world. So if you're taking notes, the two things we're going to kind of hang around here are God's work in the world and then God's expectation of us. Okay? So those are the two thoughts. Now, those are the overarching points. God's work in the world. And in a minute, we're going to fan that out just a little bit in two ways that it shows up in the book. And then we're going to talk about God's expectation. And we're going to fan that out just a little bit in three areas. Okay? So God's work, 2 areas. God's expectation, 3 areas. So here we go. God's work. When I read Esther, it's interesting that Holly's mom and dad are here today. They went to the Braves game with us last night. It was a phenomenal time. But it's interesting. I remember when y'all, I think one of y'all did this week. So, but when we lived in Athens, we were 2.5 hours away. So the kids didn't get to see grandparents, Holly's mom and dad, and my mom and dad as much. And inevitably, y'all are going to laugh, inevitably, every time they came in, they would go, oh my gosh, they've grown so much. And I remember the first time they said that, and my mom and dad said, I shrugged it off. I was like, whatever. That's just, in my mind, what the picture that immediately went in my mind is like, the sweet older grandma who pinches the, oh, you're so cute, and pinches your cheek when you were a kid, or, that stereotypical. I just thought it was polite, nice grandparent stuff. But then I realized, here's the difference. We had two different views of growth, or God's work. Growth of the kids, which I'm going to translate into God's work in our lives, right? And then we had two different views. They had the long view. We had the short view. They had the long view because it may have been 3 or 6 months in between seeing kids. So they went from here to here. So they knew immediately they'd grown 3 inches. And Holly and I are like, have they really grown that much? Because all we saw was a 64th of an inch a day. Right? So it was like, and we never noticed it. Right? And so they had the long view, we had the short view. And isn't that how we view God's work in the world and God's work in our own life, right? We don't see what God is doing in and around us because we're in it every day. We're living life. We're raising kids. We're going to the ballpark. We're doing this. The car breaks down. And this happens, and that happens, and this happens, and that happens, right? And we don't see God working because we only see that 64th of an inch every day. But then someone comes along from the outside and says, man, you look how far you've gone. Look at this. And what they have is the grandparent view. They see the whole picture, whereas we only see one pixel of the picture, right? And that's what we see in the book of Esther, is that we see that God is working in the world around us, even though we may not see it in the minutest way. Because what we see in the book of Esther is that even though God's name is not mentioned at all, there are no prayers. Even the closest thing we have to a prayer is what we'll read in just a minute. But there are no prayers. There's nothing going on, right? But yet we see God's work in the world and His handprint on every single page. So how does this stand out? Really quickly. This stands out to me in 2 different ways. God works in the world. Here's the first one. God works in the world even when people aren't at their best. God works in the world even when people aren't at their best. For example, there are a few things in the Esther story I realized this week as I was studying that I've never realized before. For example, try to keep this PG rated here. But in the story of Esther, when Esther is before she's going to be presented to the king, there's this small little phrase that if you read really quick, you're going to read over it. But here's what it is. It says, when the women who are trying to win the king's favor, they would go in his bedroom, they would go in his area, in his room, in the evening, and wouldn't come out until the morning. I mean, were they talking? Words with friends, maybe? Playing some Monopoly? Some cards? Come on. No. How about this? The king didn't even know Esther was a Jew until she revealed that she was a Jew at the second banquet, after they had been married for several years. Did she not go to Sabbath? Did she not pray? Did she eat the pork? I don't know. It's really good. Maybe she did. She hadn't had it and she tried it. It's like, hey, that's pretty good. Did she teach the other custom? Did she offer sacrifices to the Lord? Did she read the scriptures? Did she keep the law? Right? Because it's interesting that Esther has this, as the movie title is, One Night with the King. And he's a pagan Gentile who doesn't worship the Lord. And she's a Jew who should. And then she ends up marrying a Gentile, which is totally against. In fact, Ezra, a contemporary of her, and Nehemiah totally push back against Jews who have already moved back to the Promised Land against marrying the Canaanites who were there. So we're left with this tension, like, what do we do? Because we think Esther was this magnificent person of virtue, and she does great things. She saves a nation. But there's this other side that you're like, I ain't thought about that before. And so what do? Well, we're left with one thing. We're left with one thing, that God works even when we are not at our best. Miss Kathy, will you put up our verses for today? I want to read with you. We're going to look at these verses here. Here's the first time we're going to look at it. This is chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. Look at this with me. Mordecai said, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place. But you and your house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a feast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." God works even when people aren't at their best. And secondly, God will work whether we do or not. Listen to me. God works whether we're a part of it or not. Now, certainly, He wants us to join in what He is doing. But did you hear what Mordecai just said in the very beginning? "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place. But you and your house, you and your father's house, will perish." God will work even when we are not at His best. Even though Esther was not 100% following the Lord in every decision, even though there are these good times and bad times, God still works. And that's not to say it's carte blanche, do whatever you want to do, sin, live it up, and God's just going to, oh, that's okay. No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying God works regardless. His will is done. Nothing can stop the will of God. That's right. Whether we're a part of it or not, or whether we're at our best or not. Right? Because reality is, that's how our life is. I mean, raise your hand in here this morning if you followed the Lord's will every single moment of your life. Right. No, I'm going to go ahead and put mine down. None of us have. But God continues to work because He is a God of grace and He is a God of sovereignty. Now, that doesn't give us too much liberty to do whatever we want to do. But the reality is, in Esther, we see that God is working in the world. And God works even when we are not at our best, even when people are not at our best, and whether we're a part of it or not. Now, certainly God wants us to be a part of it, but He will continue to work. Now, that's the first point that we see in the story of Esther. Here's the second point, and maybe the more pertinent point from a practical standpoint for us today. And it is simply that God expects us to be faithful. So God works in the world, and God expects us to be faithful. Right? Now, let's be honest, that's a lot easier said than done. Right? A lot easier said than done. And I think as we look in this story, there are 3 difficulties that arise around being faithful. All right? And so we're gonna talk about how does faith play out in 3 difficulties that appear in the story of Esther. Here's the first one. Faithfulness when the Hamans of the world show up. Right? When that person who pushes your buttons shows up, are we faithful? Or when that situation comes up in your life, are we faithful? See, Haman, as we said, is the arch villain. He's the archetype of evil. But the reality is, we all have those situations and circumstances in our own life. We have Hamans right now. The question is, what are we going to do when that person comes up? See, there's usually we fall into 2 categories, but I'm going to submit to you today that Jesus offers a third. Usually what happens when Haman shows up, we usually do one of 2 things. Okay, follow with me. This is important. We say this, God has abandoned me. Right? When hardship comes and the Hamans of our life who are trying to push us away from the Lord are trying to eradicate faith from our life, and they're trying to push us away, one of the first responses we give is, God has abandoned me. Where is the Lord at? Right? As if he's left heaven and he's gone on vacation somewhere. Where has God gone? Why is he allowing this to happen to me? As if we're the only one who's ever gone through a struggle. What is going on in my life? Why is this happening? Right, that's the first. So that's one. The other one is we attack. Right? So if we don't abandon, we attack. And so we look for anything and everything we can. Right? That's what we do. Y'all didn't know I do karate, right? I learned it from Kung Fu Panda. Anyway, that's funny. If you have Kung Fu Panda. Right? But that's our usual two reactions. But I would suggest to you, or I would submit to you today, that the text of Esther and God, Jesus, offers us a third solution, which is infinitely better. Think about it. What did Mordecai, listen to me very carefully, what did Mordecai do when Haman attacked him? Did he cry, God, you have abandoned? Now, he did throw up in sackcloth and ashes as a sign of mourning and repentance. But did he mention that God had abandoned him? No. Did he go after Haman with a sword and a club? No. Do you want to know how? You want to know how he attacked the problem? By not attacking the problem. You know what he did? He was faithful to God. He was faithful to God. Right? He stayed true to God. He didn't venture to the left or the right. He could have moaned and groaned and cried out, did all this stuff, but God's left me, and all this. Or he could have tried to cut Haman with a sword, but he didn't do anything. He said, you know what? I'm not going to do either of those. I'm simply going to be faithful to what the Lord has called me to do, and that's worship him. And guess how the problem resolved itself? By Haman being faithful. Now, I'm not naive enough to say that every situation in your life is going to work out exactly like the text of this scripture. But I will submit that I believe that if we would leave the abandonment and the attack and simply be faithful to the Lord, the likelihood of our situations working out for our good significantly increases. I would say exponentially increases. Because God calls us to be faithful even when the Haman of our life shows up. So, here's a difficult question. Who is the Haman in your life, and what are you going to do about it? Are you going to cry out that the Lord's abandoned you? Are you going to attack the Haman? Or are you simply going to be faithful? I would submit to you that the Lord is calling you to be faithful. But that's not the only difficulty surrounding faith and faithfulness in this story. Here's the second one. It comes with difficult decisions. See, there are, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of unanswered questions about Esther. Really, there are. How did she do this? Did she do that? What happened here? When did this happen? What? And we don't know the answer. And in fact, the author doesn't give us the answer either. He just kind of tells us this is what happened. And you're left to kind of figure out the details. But I was reminded this week as I was studying that a lot of times we kind of fall into what I'll call the speck and the log, which is a take on what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. There's this part of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, speaking to the faithful, the ones who are following him, and he says, we have a hard time with when we see wrongs in other people. He said, what we usually do is we try to take the speck, the splinter out of someone else's eye, but we've got an entire tree in our eye. And what he means is we frame things such that we're okay with what we do wrong, but we're not okay with what other people do wrong, right? And what we have to realize is there are difficult situations that occur in our life, and we must be faithful in those. It's easy to pass judgment on other people, but God's calling us to be faithful. I'm going to be honest with you. I read this. I'm going to read you a quote here. It's a good thick paragraph, so hang on with me. Because one of the authors I read this week, her name is Karen Jobes. She explained it really, really good, and I want to read it to you today. So, and it's surrounding this idea of difficult decisions and how to be faithful and all that. It's easy to look at other people's decisions and size them up, thinking that we clearly know what is right and what is wrong. And if we were in their shoes, we could have both known and done the right thing. Because in any theoretical situation, we can define the situation simply enough to make the choices clear. You ever done that before? You've defined the situation so you would always know what to do. The reality is life isn't that easy, is it? She goes on to say, there comes a day when we find ourselves in a situation where right and wrong are not clearly defined, and every choice we have seems to be a troubling mixture of good and bad. Only God knows the end of our story from its beginning. We are responsible to Him for living faithfully in obedience to His word in every situation, as we best know how. Even, listen to this is crucial, even if we make a wrong decision, whether through innocent blunder or deliberate disobedience, our God is so gracious and omnipotent that He is able to use the weak link in a chain of events that will perfect His purpose in us and through us. Esther's story shows that we can entrust those situations to the Lord and move on. And I was reminded of Paul this week. When I read that quote, I was instantly reminded of Paul. The great apostle Paul, he says two quotes. The first one is, he says, I still find, and I'm paraphrasing here, I still find myself doing the things I don't want to do and not doing the things I do want to do. Think about that. Paul, the person who spread Christianity in the early years further than anyone else, says in the height of his ministry, I still find myself sinning when I don't want to. And I find myself omitting things that I should be doing. But later on, and I can't remember exactly where either of these quotes are, I'll have to find them later, but the other thing that Paul says is, but yet I press on, forgetting what lies behind and looking forward to what lies in front of me. And I press on to the high calling for which God has called me. Now think about that. You ever had a time in your life where you had a difficult decision to make and you really weren't sure which one to make, and one time it turned out good and the other time it turned out bad? That's this. That's what we're talking about. There are difficult situations in life that we're put in because sometimes our own mistakes, sometimes others' mistakes, sometimes it's just life, it's nobody's mistake, and yet God is calling us to be faithful. And the question then is, what do we do when we're not faithful? And the simple answer is, be faithful the next time. Because even though God calls us to be perfect, Jesus is clear in John 5. He says, go out and sin no more. Right? Clearly, that is the goal. But I believe that God realizes, although that is what we strive for, that we're still not quite going to make it. And that is ultimately why Jesus died on the cross, is to forgive us of not only the sin you did before you met Him, but to forgive you of all the sin you'll do after you met Him as well. See, Jesus' grace is just as necessary for today as it was yesterday, and it will be more necessary for tomorrow than it was last week, because we still have difficult decisions in front of us, and God desires for us to be faithful in those. And even if we blow it, and even if we mess up, and even if we do wrong, God is still so gracious and so omnipotent that He is able to use the weak link in that chain to still continue His purposes. Thirdly, really quickly, how do we be faithful during the difficulty of success? The difficulty of success. If you were to ask 100 people, what does it mean to be successful, you would get 100 different answers. I would submit to you that if you were to ask 100 church people, what does God define as success, and you'd still get 100 different answers. Right? We have a hard time defining what God means by success. Like, what does it mean to be a successful pastor? What does it mean to be a successful mother or father or grandparent or Sunday school teacher or deacon or church leader? Like, what does it mean to be successful? I submit to you that the answer is in Esther 4:16. Read it with me again. These are Esther's words. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. She could have died. because she wasn't summoned, she was going in on her own. Though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Listen to me, friends. Listen to me. Here's how you define success. Faithfulness. Faithfulness. How can I be successful as a pastor, as a father, as a leader, as a church member, a teacher, Christ follower? One word or two. Be faithful to God. That's four. Be faithful to God. Simply put. Let me read you a quote. This is about a guy I mentioned earlier, Leonard Bailey, in summarizing Jesus' parable in Luke 12, 35 through 38. Here's what he says. The servants, that's us, that's me and you. The servants are not commended. Listen to this. The servants are not commended for production, but for being faithful. The servants are not commended for production, but because they were faithful. Let me ask you a question. This is a question I've had to think long and hard about. I've been in ministry since I was 18. It's about 18 years. And here's a question I have thought about a lot in those 18 years. What does it mean to be successful as a pastor? I've had friends who have had enormous success. I have had other friends who have had little success by the world's determination of success. Right? Holly and I have one friend who went to one church and the church literally just blew up. I mean, not in a good way. I mean, not in a bad way, but in a good way. It sounded bad, like, that was bad. No, not in a bad way, but in a good way. I mean, they had people coming in droves that they had to move from one building, then they had to rent a facility while they built a building, and I mean, the church was doing really great. And then he got called to another church that was even bigger than the church he was at. Then I had another friend during the same time, and all of these were they're all in the state. I had another friend at the same time who was doing everything he could to reach his community. And you know what? Nobody in his community wanted to go to church. Like, literally, this is what he told me one day after being there for several years. I realized that everybody moved here because they wanted to get out of the big city and nobody wants to be bothered. So who is successful? Well, the answer is both of them are if they're being faithful to God. Right? See, we view success in a capitalistic structure. That is production. How much have you produced? How many souls have you won? Listen, we do this in the Georgia Baptist Convention. How many have you baptized this year? How many did Miss Andrea does that? What's that, the ACP thing or what, an annual church profile every year? And all they want to know is numbers. How many did you give? How much did you give? How many did you have in VBS? How much money did you collect at VBS? How many people did you baptize? What's your average attendance in Sunday school? How many do you have in the choir? How many do you have in men's ministry? How many do you have in women's ministry? And I understand that you got to have some metrics, in numbers, right? We need to know numbers in how many are in worship service. And we need to know numbers of how many come on Wednesday night. That's fine. I'm not saying numbers aren't bad. I like numbers. But my point is if our focus is numbers, then our focus is production, not faithfulness. And as a church and as pastors and as church members, we have bought into a production-oriented idea of success. You know what I'd rather see success? Let me give you an illustration and we'll close. I have a friend. I would call him a friend now. He was one of my students in student ministry. He started in our student ministry in 10th grade. Was shy, very quiet, kind of kept him. He was a big guy. I mean, like, big teeth, muscles everywhere. He wrestled, he played football, phenomenal, a pretty good football player, phenomenal wrestler. But you got him in, and you could just tell him something was on. Man, I'm telling you, the Lord radically changed his life. About summer in between his 10th and 11th grade year, I believe. Radically changed his life. And almost every phone call I get from this young man right now is, hey man, I've been reading my Bible. I need you. What does Jesus mean by this? Or hey, I'm working at this church now. I'm interning. I'm not even getting paid. But man, I got passion for youth ministry. I think this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. I'm trying to figure out how I can go to seminary. What's the best place for me to go to seminary? That's the questions I'm at with this young man. You know what he says at the end of every conversation? He's 20, he's 21. Hey man, how are things going at your church? How can I pray for you? Are you and Holly doing okay? How are the kids? That doesn't show up on any ACP
Nope.
report.
Sure don't.
You can't quantify that in a number. But I would submit to you that that young man is being faithful to the Lord. And there's no way to numerically statify. I'm going to create a word. Statistically statify that. You can't put that on paper. There's no graph to chart that. But what I can tell you, and I'm not trying to be all preachery in this moment, but what I can tell you is that young man started over here and he has moved toward Jesus. And the crazy part is he's brought other people with him. And again, to me, success is not numbers. It is, are you being faithful to the Lord? And I would submit to you, the more you are faithful to the Lord, the more you will move closer to Jesus. That's why I love our win, our mission, vision, whatever you want to call it, moving ourselves and others toward Christ. If that is our goal, then we must be faithful. And if we are faithful, we will continue to move closer to Jesus and we'll bring people along with us. So what's our challenge today? What do we need to think about or be challenged to do this week? Well, I've got 2 actions and 1 thought. Here's the first action for us. Join in God's work. Remember, God is working. Even when we're not perfect and even when we're not doing our best, God is still working. And God will work whether we're involved or not. My challenge to you this week is join God's work. He's out there. God is moving in our community. Find where He's moving and join Him. The second action is choose faithfulness. You're going to face some difficult situations this week. Things are going to come up in your life that you didn't plan for, that you didn't prepare for. My friend, still choose faithfulness. And then here's the thought. And this is what this hit me really hard this week, or in a good way. And remember that God is gracious even when you're not at your best. God is gracious even when you are not at your best. Joining God's work, choose faithfulness, and remember, God is gracious even when we're not at our best. All right? And Lord, thank you so much for today. Lord, thank you that you are faithful even when we are not. But Lord, I pray that you would increase our faith. Lord, that you would continue to move in our church, and in our hearts, and in our lives, and in our community. And Lord, may we be a part of it. Lord, may we choose faith. Lord, may we choose faith. Lord, may we follow you wherever we are, no matter what's going on, no matter what decision, whether the Haman in our life shows up today or tomorrow. Or Lord, whether we're confronted with the difficulty of success. Lord, may we choose faithfulness. Joining in your work. And Lord, I just have to believe that if we will endeavor in those 2 things, Lord, we will see a mighty, mighty move of God in our hearts and lives, and in this church and in our community. So Lord, as we go out today, Lord, may we choose faith. And Lord, may we join